Early March 1943, Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. The wrench slipped from oil-stained hands as Captain Paul Irvin Gunn stared at the bomber standing in front of him. Inside that aircraft was something that was never meant to exist. Something that broke every rule in the United States Army Air Force's manual. Something his commanding officer had never officially approved. Where the glass nose for a bombardier should have been, 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns now pointed outward. The B-25 Mitchell, originally designed as a medium bomber for high-altitude precision strikes, had been completely reinvented. It was no longer just a bomber. It was now a ship killer, a commerce destroyer, an unauthorized experiment that could either change the course of the Pacific War or land Captain Gunn in front of a court-martial. What no one, not even Gunn himself, realized at that moment was that this desperate and furious modification would soon help deliver the most crushing defeat the Japanese Navy would face during the entire Pacific campaign. The math behind Allied victory in the Southwest Pacific was not being calculated in Washington war rooms. It was being shaped in welding shops and maintenance hangars by a 43-year-old rebel officer who was fighting his own private war. That journey had started 2 years earlier, on December 8, 1941, Manila time. Paul Irvin Gunn, not yet known by anyone as Pappy, stood at Nichols Field as Japanese bombers systematically destroyed America's air power in the Philippines. At that time, Gunn was the manager of the newly formed Philippine Airlines, with 4 civilian Beech-18 aircraft under his control. Within hours, Major General Louis Brereton took command of those planes and quickly commissioned Gunn as a captain in the key Army Air Force. What should have been a short, wartime duty soon turned into a 3-year mission, filled with innovation, vengeance, and groundbreaking ideas that would reshape the air war in the Pacific. Paul Irvin Gunn was 42 years old, a former Navy Chief Petty Officer who had already served 20 years as an enlisted naval aviator before retiring in December 1939. He had learned to fly back in the 1920s, served with the famous Top Hatters Fighter Squadron, and even taught new pilots at Pensacola Naval Air Station. Gunn didn't just know airplanes from manuals, he knew them from years of building them, flying them, repairing them, and sometimes even crashing them. But on that December morning in 1941, all his technical skill meant nothing compared to the crisis at hand. His wife, Clara Louise, known to everyone as Polly, and their 4 children were still in Manila as Japanese forces closed in. His 2 sons, Paul Jr. and Nathan, were teenagers, while his daughters, Connie and Julie, were younger. The family had been living a comfortable life in Manila, while Gunn managed the airline, but that world collapsed overnight. In the frantic weeks that followed, Gunn flew mission after mission across the crumbling Philippine defenses. He carried out reconnaissance flights, transported men and supplies, and pushed his luck against overwhelming odds. He dodged Japanese fighters, survived being shot down in the jungle, trekked to safety, and then immediately climbed into another aircraft to fly again. On one daring mission, he earned the Distinguished Flying Cross by flying an unarmed transport into Bataan to deliver critical medical supplies to American troops under siege. He crossed Japanese-controlled skies with nothing but courage, experience, and raw determination. But no matter what he did, he couldn't reach his family. On Christmas Eve 1941, Gunn was ordered to evacuate key personnel to Australia. He drew all of his pay, borrowed every dollar he could from fellow officers, and prepared to fly his wife and children to safety. The Japanese advance was too fast. Polly and the children couldn't make it to the airfield in time. Gunn was faced with an impossible choice: disobey his orders and risk capture with his family, or leave them behind and continue the fight. In the end, he followed his orders. He flew to Australia, knowing the war was bigger than one man's family, but also knowing the cost would be unbearable. Just weeks later, on January 20th, 1942, Polly and the children were captured by Japanese forces and taken to the University of Santo Tomas, which had been turned into an internment camp for enemy civilians. When Gunn received the news, something inside him broke. The man who kept flying missions after that was not the same man who had left Manila. He had left behind his wife and 4 children in the hands of an enemy known for cruelty. Every single day they remained in that camp was a day he could not protect them. The only thing he could do was end the war faster. If he couldn't save his family directly, He vowed to smash every ship, every airplane, every supply line that kept Japanese forces fed in the Philippines. This wasn't official policy. It was personal revenge dressed up as invention. In late July 1942, Major General George C. Kenney arrived in Brisbane to take command of the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. What he found was a mess. His predecessor had been relieved. Morale was at rock bottom. Equipment was short. The Japanese controlled the skies over New Guinea and were even threatening Australia. General Douglas MacArthur, the theatre commander, had little faith in the air forces and made that opinion painfully clear. Kenney was 53 years old, a World War I fighter ace with 2 confirmed kills and a Silver Star. He had taught at the Air Corps Tactical School and was known for thinking outside the box. After MacArthur gave him an hour-long dressing down about Allied air weaknesses, Kenney listened and then asked for one unusual power. The authority to send home anyone he judged was deadwood. MacArthur, taken aback, agreed. Within weeks, Kenney reshaped his command. He brought in aggressive younger officers and set up a forward headquarters in New Guinea. To speed decisions, he named Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead his forward commander, giving Whitehead the power to change aircraft assignments based on weather and battlefield conditions instead of waiting for orders from Brisbane. But swapping people alone wouldn't fix the problem. Allied bombing from medium and high altitude was failing to stop Japanese ships. High-altitude attacks gave enemy vessels time to dodge. B-17 flying fortresses were hitting less than 1% of their targets. Japanese convoys kept resupplying their garrisons in New Guinea, and Allied ground troops were dying in the jungle while fresh Japanese units landed from ships that the bombers simply could not sink. Kenney had been wrestling with this since 1928 when he taught at the tactical school. He had imagined skip bombing, dropping bombs at very low altitude so they would skip across the water like stones and strike a ship's hull below the waterline where armor was weakest. The idea made sense. Making it work was much harder. The B-17s didn't have forward-firing armament, and medium and high-altitude tactics were proving useless against nimble convoys. Coming in at mast height meant flying straight into a storm of anti-aircraft fire with nothing to suppress the gunners. That was the danger, until Kenney found Paul Gunn, and everything began to change. In August 1942, Kenney learned someone in the 3rd Attack Group had been modifying A-20 Havoc light bombers without permission. The changes were rough but effective. The transparent bombardier's nose had been removed and replaced with forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. The idea was simple and brutal. Strafe Japanese positions at hair-raising low altitude, knock out the gunners, then drop the bombs. Kenney investigated and discovered Captain Paul Gunn working almost alone, scavenging weapons from wrecked fighters and bolting them into attack planes. Gunn hadn't gone to engineering school, but he had learned aircraft inside out from years of hands-on work. He understood structures, weight distribution, and weapons well enough to make them work. Most officers would have court-martialed him for altering military aircraft without orders. Kenney did the opposite. He put Gunn on his personal staff as a special projects officer and gave him a nearly impossible task: modify every A-20 in the theater for low-altitude attack, and do it now. Gunn worked non-stop, often 18-hour days. He pulled guns from wrecked planes, fabricated mounting brackets in makeshift workshops, and personally test-flew every aircraft he changed. He added 450 caliber machine guns to the nose of each A-20, mounted extra guns along the fuselage, and fitted bomb racks for parachute fragmentation bombs. The modified A-20s entered combat in September 1942, striking a Japanese airfield at Buna. The results blew expectations out of the water. The strafing A-20s came in at treetop level, guns blazing, silencing anti-aircraft positions before the bombs fell. Japanese defenders, used to spotting high-altitude bombers minutes before impact, had almost no time to react. The attack destroyed dozens of aircraft on the ground and proved that low-level strafing could change how air warfare was fought. Kenney immediately ordered Gunn to start a similar program for B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. The B-25 was bigger than the A-20, had longer range, carried more bombs, and could hold more forward-firing weapons. If Gunn could turn the Mitchell into a gunship, it would become the most dangerous anti-shipping weapon in the theater. The B-25 Mitchell had been designed in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber. It was a twin-engine aircraft with a wingspan of 67 ft-7 powered by two Wright R2600 radial engines producing 700 horsepower each. Normal armament included 650 caliber machine guns for defense and up to 3,000 lb of bombs. It carried a crew of 5, pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, and gunner. The aircraft was named after General Billy Mitchell, the outspoken advocate for air power, who had been court-martialed in 1925 for his views. Approximately 9,190 B-25s would eventually be built at two North American aviation plants, one in Inglewood, California, and another in Kansas City. Kansas, the B-25 had already won fame in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25Bs on a daring raid against Tokyo, launching from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. The raid did little physical damage, but it delivered a massive morale boost to Americans still reeling from Pearl Harbor and forced Japan to hold more fighters back to defend the home islands. Still, the B-25's main job remained medium-altitude bombing, and that role was failing against ships. Gunn looked at the Mitchell and saw something different, potential no one else had fully considered. The B-25's nose was big enough to hold several heavy machine guns. Its twin-engine layout offered a safety net. Losing one engine didn't mean the plane was finished. The Mitchell was built tough and could take a lot of damage. Most important, it had the range to reach Japanese shipping lanes that the shorter-range A-20 couldn't touch. In late 1942, Gunn began converting B-25s in a maintenance hangar at Townsville, Australia. He worked with Captain Jack Fox, the North American aviation technical representative in the theater. Fox's job should have been to make sure factory rules were followed. Instead, he became Gunn's co-conspirator in what turned into the war's most effective unauthorized modification program. The key first job was removing the bombardier and the glass nose. That saved weight and removed a weak point that wasn't needed for low-altitude attacks. Gunn replaced the clear nose with a solid metal one and put 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns in its place, all firing forward and controlled by the pilot. Each gun carried 500 rounds. With a firing rate of about 850 rounds per minute per gun, the pilot could unleash an instant wall of lead that would shred almost anything in seconds. But 4 guns didn't satisfy Gunn. He added 2 more 50s in cheek blisters on either side of the forward fuselage, just below and a little behind the cockpit. Those package guns stuck out slightly past the propeller arc, so they could fire safely without bullets striking the propellers. They were fixed, forward-firing weapons that increased the pilot's punch. Then Gunn made a bolder move. The B-25 had a dorsal turret, with twin 50 caliber guns mounted behind the cockpit. He locked that turret facing forward and wired it so those 2 guns could be fired from the cockpit. The co-pilot could use a sight to operate them, or the pilot could fire every gun at once with a master trigger. After these changes, the modified B-25 packed 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns, delivering roughly 180 lb of projectiles every second. By comparison, a single P-51 Mustang carried 650 caliber guns. The modified Mitchell combined the forward firepower of more than one fighter with the ability to carry 2,000 lb of bombs. Those upgrades brought serious engineering headaches. Putting heavy guns and ammo in the nose pushed the plane's center of gravity forward, making it nose-heavy and harder to control. Gunn fixed that by moving equipment aft and adding ballast in the tail. Firing 8 guns at once produced massive recoil, so he reinforced the nose with extra bracing. The guns also ran hot and filled the cockpit with smoke. Gunn added ventilation and moved ammunition storage to reduce fire risk. The most critical task was gun harmonization. All 8 guns had to be aligned, so their bullets converged at a single point ahead of the aircraft, usually between 200 and 400 YD. If the guns weren't properly set, rounds would scatter and miss the target entirely. Gunn spent long hours fine-tuning mounts and sights until the guns hit together where they were supposed to. Gunn developed a strict ground test routine. He set up targets at measured distances and adjusted each gun mount until all 8 weapons converged exactly where he wanted. He test-fired the guns himself, making tiny tweaks and refusing to approve any aircraft that didn't meet his standards. When he and his crew worked around the clock, the full modification took about 2 weeks per aircraft. Gunn taught maintenance crews the process and turned the work into a production line routine. By December 1942, he had modified enough B-25s to outfit the 91st Bombardment Squadron. The squadron needed a commander who knew low-altitude attack and wasn't bound by old bombing rules. Kenny chose Major Edlin Lana, a pilot who rose from first lieutenant to major in just weeks because of his bold leadership. Lana had shown skill in low-level missions and had earned Kenny's trust. Lana and Gunn together shaped the tactics that would change naval combat. Their plan was simple and terrifying. The modified B-25s would fly at extremely low altitude, sometimes as low as 50 ft above the water, pushing to top speed, about 300 mph. At that height and speed, ship gunners found it nearly impossible to track the planes. The closing speed was so great that manual aiming could not keep up, and the bomber was gone before most gunners could adjust. As the B-25s closed in, pilots opened up with all 8 forward guns at roughly 1,000 wide, walking the fire onto the ship. The stream of 50 caliber bullets swept the decks, killed or suppressed anti-aircraft crews, wrecked gun positions, shredded superstructures, and threw the ship into chaos. The goal wasn't always to sink the ship with gunfire, though the damage could be severe. The immediate aim was to silence defenses and terrify the crew. Then came the bomb. At about 200 to 400 YD, flying at the minimum safe altitude, the pilot released a bomb with a 4 to 5 second delayed fuse. The bomb left the plane at 300 mph, struck the water, and skipped across the surface. It might bounce once or twice, then slam into the hull at or below the waterline. The delayed fuse kept it from exploding on contact. The bomb punched into the side, sank slightly, and then detonated. Exploding below the waterline hit the ship where it was weakest, under the armor belt where hull plating was thin. Water carried shock waves with deadly force. A single bomb could break a keel, rupture fuel tanks, flood engine rooms, and cause catastrophic structural failure. By the time the bomb exploded, the B-25 was already past the target, climbing fast to avoid the blast and any secondary explosions. From the first gunshot to bomb release, the whole attack took about 10 seconds. Skip bombing itself wasn't brand new. The British had tried versions of it, and a few American pilots had experimented independently. But pairing skip bombing with relentless forward firepower was Gunn's innovation. The strafe-equipped nose turned the bomber into its own fighter escort, suppressing defenses before the bombs fell. This new combination would prove devastating. While Gunn was busy modifying aircraft, Allied intelligence was tracking Japanese naval moves. Ultra-intercepts and a code-breaking team known as Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, FRUML, were reading Japanese messages almost in real time. In late February 1943, FRUML picked up signals showing a major Japanese convoy assembling at Rabaul. The convoy's destination was Lae on the northern coast of New Guinea. The intelligence was precise. 8 transport ships would carry about 6,900 troops of the Japanese 51st Division, escorted by 8 destroyers. The convoy was due to sail from Rabaul at midnight on February 28, 1943, and arrive at Lae roughly 3 days later. This was Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea. If it succeeded, Japanese forces there would be far stronger and could stop Allied advances. If it failed, Japan would lose thousands of veteran troops and might never try another large sea reinforcement. General Kenny saw a chance to test his modified planes and new tactics against the single most important target in the theater since Pearl Harbor. He gathered every available aircraft for a coordinated strike: B-17 flying fortresses to bomb from medium altitude, Royal Australian Air Force fighters for low-level strafing, P-38 Lightning fighters for cover, and the modified B-25 strafers to carry out skip bombing attacks. It would be the biggest coordinated air operation in the Southwest Pacific so far. Kenny personally briefed squadron commanders on February 28th. The orders were blunt: find the convoy, attack without mercy, give no quarter, sink every ship. This wasn't a raid. It was meant to be annihilation. At midnight on February 28, 1943, the convoy left Simpson Harbor at Rabaul under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. The force included 8 transports and 8 destroyer escorts, Among the destroyers were Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo. About 100 Japanese Zero fighters were also slated to provide air cover during the voyage. This was the strongest resupply force Japan had mustered for New Guinea. The convoy was spotted that afternoon by a B-24 Liberator on patrol. The crew radioed in the position, course, and composition. Kenny's command launched reconnaissance aircraft to keep track of the convoy. 2 tropical storms moved through the area and at first helped the Japanese by providing cloud cover and reduced visibility. Allied planes maintained contact but couldn't press their attacks effectively through the storms. The convoy made steady progress at only 7 knots, about 8 mph, limited by the heavily loaded transports. The destroyers could have done 20 knots or more, but they had to keep pace with the slow transports. By nightfall on March 1st, the convoy had covered about 90 Menambalame. They were roughly halfway to Leh. The weather was getting worse, which Kimura welcomed. Fewer Allied planes meant less chance of attack. But the storms also tossed the transports around, and the troops cramped below decks suffered badly from seasickness. On the morning of March 2, 1943, the skies cleared enough for Allied reconnaissance to regain visual contact. At about 10 naus in the morning, 29 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked from 5,000 FT. As expected, high-altitude bombing did little real damage. The B-17s reported hits, but Japanese records show only minimal harm. One transport may have been slightly damaged. Still, the attack forced the convoy to change course repeatedly, slowing its progress toward Leh. More B-17 strikes followed throughout March 2nd. The fortresses dropped dozens of bombs from various heights. Ships maneuvered desperately, while Japanese fighters engaged the bombers. Several B-17s were damaged, and 3 Japanese fighters were shot down, but no transports were sunk. The high-altitude raids harassed the convoy, but they did not stop it. As night fell on March 2nd, Kenny knew the decisive strike would come the next morning. The modified B-25s were ready. Major Lana had briefed his crews again and again. The pilots had practiced the attack profile on a wrecked ship on February 28th, using combined formations of B-17s, B-25s, P-38s, and RAAF bow fighters. Every pilot knew exactly what to do. Skip bombing had been rehearsed. The strafer guns had been harmonized. The ordnance was loaded. The moment of action was near. At dawn on March 3, 1943, weather conditions were perfect for an air attack. Clear skies, good visibility, calm seas. Kimura must have felt a chill. His convoy sat about 30 miles from Leh, close enough for some support from shore-based anti-aircraft guns, but still exposed to air assault. The Allied strike force gathered at Cape Ward Hunt on the northern coast of Papua. About 90 Allied aircraft converged on the convoy, including B-17 Flying Fortresses, modified B-25 strafers, Royal Australian Air Force bow fighters, and P-38 Lightning fighters for escort. Multiple waves would strike from different directions during the day. The attack began at about 10:02 in the morning. The B-17s struck first from medium altitude, forcing the convoy to scatter and maneuver. Their bombing runs didn't sink ships, but they drew fire and set the stage for what came next. Moments later, the low-flying aircraft swept in. The RAF bow fighters were first, tearing across the convoy with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns blazing. Their fire smashed into anti-aircraft positions, knocking out gunners before they could fully react. Japanese destroyers answered with everything they had, but the attackers were moving too fast and too low for accurate fire. Then came the modified B-25 strafers, and the real destruction began. They attacked in wave after wave throughout the morning. One pilot locked onto the transport Kyokusei Maru, dropping to just 50 FT above the water. At 1,000 wide out, he opened fire. 8 50 caliber machine guns firing a combined 6,800 rounds per minute, 180 pounds of lead every second, raked across the ship. Tracer rounds lit the air, walking from bow to superstructure. Sailors fell instantly. Gun positions were blasted apart. The bridge collapsed under the torrent of fire. At 200 YD, the pilot released 2 500 lb general-purpose bombs with delayed fuses. They skipped once across the surface and slammed into the hull just below the waterline. Seconds later, they detonated. The double blast ripped open the bottom of the Kyokusei Maru, flooding its holds and engine room. Listing hard to port, the transport went under in less than 15 minutes. Other B-25s followed with the same deadly precision. Each pilot picked a target, strafed decks clean of defenders, and dropped skipping bombs that tore ships apart. The Kembu Maru was hammered by at least 3 aircraft. Continuous gunfire wiped out most of its crew above deck. 4 bombs tore into its hull, breaking the ship in half. There it sank in under 10 minutes. The Teiyo Maru was hit so hard by strafing fire that flames erupted across its superstructure. 2 bombs blew open its sides, sending it down with nearly 1,000 troops still trapped aboard. The Nojima tried to evade but was too slow. A B-25 raked its stern to bow, then planted 2 bombs in the engine room. Powerless and flooding, it would sink later that day. The Beaufighters and remaining B-25s turned their guns on the escorting destroyers. Admiral Kimura's flagship, the Shirayuki, was strafed mercilessly. Almost everyone on the bridge was killed, and Kimura himself was wounded. A bomb struck near the stern, setting off the magazines. Secondary explosions ripped off the rear of the ship, sending it to the bottom. The destroyer Tokitsukaze was next, hit by bombs that set off fuel tanks. It became a fireball and sank within an hour. Meanwhile, Arashio collided with the crippled Nojima while maneuvering, suffering severe damage. It was abandoned and later sank. All the while, Japanese Zero fighters tried desperately to protect the convoy. But P-38 Lightnings kept them engaged high above, while the B-25s thundered in at mast height, far too low for the Zeros to dive without risking friendly fire on their own ships. The slaughter at sea was now fully underway. The attack had lasted just 40 minutes. When the Allied aircraft finally pulled away to rearm and refuel, the scene below was a nightmare of fire and wreckage. 4 transports were already sinking or gone. 3 destroyers lay shattered beneath the waves. The once proud convoy was broken apart, its formations scattered into chaos. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors thrashed in the burning oil-slicked waters, while bodies floated among the debris. The slaughter wasn't over. That afternoon, Allied squadrons returned to finish the job. The modified B-25s, their strafing guns blazing, hunted down the survivors one by one. Each ship was isolated. Each was methodically destroyed. Skip bombs hammered their hulls, tearing open steel and flooding holds. The destroyer Asashio, already limping from earlier attacks, took more direct hits. Flames consumed it before it slipped beneath the sea. By nightfall on March 3rd, the outcome was absolute. All 8 Japanese transports had been sunk. 4 of the 8 destroyers were gone. Around 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors had been killed outright. Another 2,700 clung to wreckage or were later rescued by destroyers and submarines from Rabaul. Barely 200 men ever reached Leh, and most of them arrived without weapons, equipment, or supplies. Of the 6,900 troops who set out, more than 5,700 had been lost. The cost to the Allies was astonishingly light. 1 B-17, Flying Fortress and 3 P-38 fighters failed to return, just 13 aircrew killed in exchange for the destruction of an entire convoy. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had rewritten the rules of war. For the first time, land-based aircraft had annihilated a heavily escorted naval formation. Skip bombing, once dismissed as a desperate experiment, was now proven doctrine. The strafer B-25 had validated every risk Paul Gunn had taken. The strategic impact was immediate. Japan never again attempted a large troop convoy to New Guinea. Its garrisons there, cut off from resupply, would slowly wither, starving in place as the Allies advanced. General MacArthur's communique exaggerated the results, claiming 22 ships sunk and 12,000 dead. But the truth was devastating enough. General George Kenney had proven his vision. Paul Gunn's unauthorized modifications had changed the war. From his workshop in Australia, Gunn could only feel grim satisfaction. His designs had destroyed the enemy at sea, but his family remained imprisoned on Santo Tomas, and his personal war was far from finished. The victory triggered an immediate surge in the program. Kenney ordered every available B-25 converted into strafer configuration. Gunn worked day and night training crews, refining tactics and streamlining production. By mid-1943, most of the B-25s in the Southwest Pacific carried his modifications. Even North American Aviation, the aircraft's manufacturer, had taken notice. The maverick engineer, once nearly court-martialed for breaking the rules, had just forced the entire U.S. Army Air Force to rewrite. Them company officials soon realized that Paul Gunn's improvised modifications were not just field experiments, they were the future of the B-25. Representatives from North American aviation visited Gunn's makeshift workshops, studied the altered aircraft, and asked him for detailed specifications. The company wanted his ideas integrated into factory production. Gunn's success could no longer be ignored. He was promoted to major and sent back to the United States, where he worked directly with North American aviation engineers at their plants in Englewood, California, and Kansas City. For months in 1943 and early 1944, Gunn poured his experience into designing factory-built strafer versions of the B-25. The first result was the B-25G, which carried 450 caliber machine guns in the nose, plus something radical, a 75mm cannon. The cannon fired a 14.7-pound shell capable of punching through ship armor or destroying fortified bunkers. In theory, it turned the B-25 into a flying tank killer. In practice, the weapon was slow to reload and required an extra crewman in the nose. Gunn personally tested the cannon in combat. On one raid with the 3rd Attack Group, he fired directly into a Japanese destroyer, smashing its fire control systems and leaving it defenseless. The ship was finished off with bombs. Gunn proudly told others it was the cannon that sank the destroyer, but privately, he admitted the truth. It was conventional ordnance that did the killing. Next came the B-25H, built in larger numbers. Over 1,000 rolled off the line, each bristling with a 75mm cannon and up to 14 50 caliber machine guns. The dorsal turret was moved forward for better coverage, and the co-pilot's seat was removed to save weight, leaving the navigator to handle cannon loading. The result was terrifyingly powerful, but also dangerously unbalanced. The B-25H was nose-heavy and difficult to fly. At Wright Field, the Army Air Force's testing center, engineers sent Gunn a warning that the modifications made the aircraft unsafe and recommended grounding it until the center of gravity issue was resolved. Gunn's legendary reply summed up his wartime philosophy. Put center of gravity in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight. Whether the story is literal or apocryphal, it captured his attitude. Technical perfection was less important than battlefield results, and pilots quickly learned to handle the aircraft despite its quirks. The final wartime production model, the B-25J, struck a balance. Some carried a traditional bombardier nose, while others retained Gunn's strafer configuration. A staggering 4,318 were built, making it the most numerous variant of the Mitchell. At maximum armament, some J models carried 8 forward-firing nose guns, 4 cheek guns, 2 turret guns, and 4 waist guns, a total of 18 50 caliber machine guns. It was the heaviest armed bomber of World War II, a flying arsenal designed as much for psychological shock as for raw destruction. By 1943 and 1944, Japanese troops had come to recognize the sound of approaching B-25 engines. The deep growling roar meant devastation was seconds away. On the ground, panic spread at the sound alone, and devastation did follow. In August 1943, B-25 strafers struck Japanese airfields at Wewak, New Guinea. The raids destroyed 174 aircraft on the ground in just a few days, crippling Japanese air power in the region and cementing the B-25's reputation as one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific. The devastating raids on Wewak were possible only because Paul Gunn had solved another problem: range. The B-25 had enough fuel for most missions, but Wewak lay at the very edge of its endurance. Gunn improvised a solution. He fitted auxiliary fuel tanks into the bomb bay. Once the fuel was used, the tanks were shoved out through an open hatch in the floor. It was crude, dangerous, and filled the fuselage with choking fumes while wind howled through the cabin. But it worked. The range of the Mitchell was extended by hundreds of miles, and that extra distance made Wewak possible. The Wewak raids shattered Japanese air superiority over New Guinea. Allied ground forces advanced almost unopposed from the air, a turning point in the campaign. By late 1943, Gunn's modified B-25s were proving their worth again, this time over one of the strongest Japanese bases in the Pacific. In November 1943, Major Raymond "Jock" Hennebrey led 38 B-25 strafers against Rabaul Harbor, a fortress bristling with anti-aircraft guns and warships. The Mitchells came in at mast height, skimming just above the water. P-38 fighters provided top cover, while phosphorus bombs created thick smoke screens to conceal the attackers' approach. What followed was one of the most spectacular raids of the Pacific War. Out of 38 ships in the harbor, 30 were hit. A heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and countless transports and support vessels were sunk or crippled. The raid paralyzed Rabaul as a forward operating base and sent a chilling message. Not even Japan's most heavily defended strongholds were safe from the low-flying Mitchells. The legend of the aircraft only grew. During the Philippines campaign of 1944, B-25 strafers became a constant nightmare for Japanese troops. They ripped apart supply lines, shredded convoys, and struck ships across the archipelago. Their attacks came so fast and so low that defenders barely had time to react. To the Japanese, the modified Mitchells earned a nickname whispered in fear, the Bat Out of Hell. By then, Gunn's aircraft had destroyed hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft on the ground, and tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. They had isolated Japanese garrisons, starved them of supplies, and handed MacArthur the air superiority needed to execute his island-hopping strategy. Gunn's improvised weapons were not the only tools of victory in the Pacific, but they were among the most effective. Yet, even as his planes tore across the skies, Gunn's personal war weighed heavily. His wife and children remained imprisoned at Santo Tomas. Occasionally, censored letters reached him through the Red Cross, but they were rare and heartbreaking. He knew life inside the camp was deteriorating. Food was scarce, disease rampant, and the guards grew crueler as Japan's fortunes collapsed. Gunn could do nothing for them, except fight harder, hoping that every raid, every burning ship brought the war's end closer. By late 1944, the tide had turned. American forces stormed ashore at Leyte in the Philippines. Gunn was there, still flying combat missions at the age of 45, still searching for new ways to kill the enemy more efficiently. In the closing months of 1944, fate finally caught up with Pappy Gunn. One night, Japanese bombers struck Tacloban airfield on Leyte. White phosphorus bombs rained down, explosions ripped the ground apart, and fragments tore into Gunn's shoulder. The wound was devastating. His right arm shattered, leaving him in constant pain and effectively ending his combat flying career. He was evacuated to Australia, where he would spend months in recovery. For Gunn, the war in the cockpit was over, but his personal war, the one that had driven him for 3 relentless years, was finally nearing its end. On February 3, 1945, elements of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division stormed into Manila. Forming a flying column, they raced through Japanese lines and reached the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp. Inside, over 4,000 prisoners, emaciated, starving, and moments from execution, waited for salvation. The cavalry broke through just in time. Amid chaos and firefights in the streets, the internees were freed. Among them were Polly Gunn and her 4 children. They had survived 3 years and 14 days of imprisonment. When General Douglas MacArthur visited the camp shortly afterward, he personally ensured the Gunn family was flown to Australia. Weeks later, Paul Gunn, still recovering from his wounds, embraced the family he had last seen on Christmas Eve 1941. The reunion was joyous, but also bittersweet. The children had grown into young adults, hardened by hunger and deprivation. Polly had kept them alive through sheer determination. They were a family again, but they were forever changed by war. Gunn remained in the service after his recovery. Promoted to lieutenant colonel, he continued to innovate, advising on aircraft modifications and tactical development, though he never again flew combat missions. On June 30, 1948, he medically retired with the rank of full colonel. His decorations told their own story: the Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, 9 Purple Hearts, and numerous campaign ribbons and unit citations. Those 9 Purple Hearts meant he had been wounded in action 9 separate times, a testament to a man who had always flown at the edge of danger. After the war, Gunn returned to the Philippines and resumed his civilian life. He helped rebuild Philippine Airlines, reconnecting islands long cut off by war. He was still flying, still taking risks, still pushing the limits of what an aircraft could do. On October 11, 1957, just 7 days before his 58th birthday, Gunn was piloting a charter flight when the plane encountered a violent storm. It went down, killing him instantly. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn died as he had lived, flying. He was laid to rest at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida, where decades earlier he had trained young aviators, but his legacy lived on. The B-25 strafer modifications he had pioneered became standard across the Pacific theater. Nearly 10,000 B-25 Mitchells were built, thousands configured as strafers based directly on his designs. The skip-bombing tactics he championed sank hundreds of Japanese ships, turning the tide of the Pacific War. More than that, Gunn proved something greater, that innovation and courage could come from anywhere. The U.S. Army Air Force's bureaucracy had wanted to fight the war with existing weapons and conventional tactics. Gunn showed that desperate circumstances demanded bold ideas, and that one grieving father in a dusty maintenance hangar could reshape the very nature of air combat. Paul Pappy Gunn's war was over. His legacy, however, would endure for generations. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea quickly became a case study in military academies around the world. It was the perfect demonstration of how intelligence, coordination, and innovative tactics, combined with new weapons, could deliver a decisive victory at minimal cost. The results spoke for themselves. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, more than 5,000 Japanese casualties, all for the loss of just 4 Allied aircraft. The lesson was unmistakable. In modern war, you could not survive without control of the skies. Every ship that went down in the Bismarck Sea represented soldiers who would never reach the battlefield, weapons that would never be fired, and supplies that would never be used. Stopping the enemy before reinforcements and resources ever arrived was the most efficient way to fight. At the heart of this transformation was the modified B-25 Mitchell, with its extended range, crushing firepower, and skip-bombing capability. A single B-25 strafer could accomplish what once required coordinated attacks from multiple aircraft types. Japan learned this lesson, but far too late. After the disaster, Japanese commanders realized they could no longer move large convoys in daylight within Allied air range. They shifted to night operations, tried to slip submarines through with vital supplies, and relied heavily on small barges hugging coastlines to avoid detection. These tactics slowed losses but did not stop them. B-25 strafers adapted. They hunted barges with the same ruthlessness they had shown against transports. Radar-equipped B-25s prowled the night skies, finding and destroying convoys in darkness. For Japanese logistics, there was no safe time, no safe place, and no safe method. Month by month, the stranglehold tightened. Outposts in New Guinea, the Philippines, and across the Pacific Islands were cut off, left to wither without resupply. Japanese troops fought on with determination and courage, but courage could not overcome hunger, disease, and dwindling ammunition. They were isolated, and ultimately they were doomed. By 1945, the modified B-25 had become the standard anti-shipping weapon of the Pacific War. The aircraft continued to evolve through the B-25G, H and J variants, each incorporating heavier forward-firing armament, but the core idea remained Gunn's original vision: turn a medium bomber into a flying gunship that could sweep defenses aside and strike at point-blank range. Even in the final days of the war, B-25s were still flying combat missions. Fittingly, they were among the E aircraft that escorted the Japanese surrender. Delegation from Tokyo to Manila in August 1945, the same bombers that had crippled Japan's supply lines now bore E, witness to its surrender. In the years after the war, both American and Japanese historians confirmed the significance of Gunn's innovations. Japanese naval officers openly admitted that after the Bismarck Sea, they knew large convoys could no longer be risked within range of Allied air power. The psychological impact was almost as devastating as the physical destruction. Commanders understood that low-flying bombers could strike without warning, wiping out entire formations before defenses could even respond. The modified B-25 had created a new kind of warfare. Medium bombers were now capable of hunting ships with the precision of submarines and the destructive power of cruisers. The implications reached far beyond the Pacific. After 1945, air forces around the world studied the lessons of skip bombing, forward-firing armament, and the devastating efficiency of Gunn's innovations. The concept of the gunship, an aircraft designed not for high-altitude bombing, but for unleashing overwhelming gunfire at close range, did not end with World War II. Its DNA lived on in later conflicts. In Vietnam, the AC-47 Spooky, AC-119, and AC-130 Spectre gunships traced their lineage back to Gunn's modified B-25s, proof that one man's battlefield improvisation had reshaped the future of aerial warfare. Of the nearly 10,000 B-25 Mitchells built during the war, more than 100 survive today. Many still fly, restored and maintained in the United States. At air shows, crowds are drawn to their presence. The size, the sound, the history. The deep roar of the Wright R2600 engines is unforgettable. And when a B-25 banks low across a field, it echoes the same terrifying image Japanese sailors once saw seconds before destruction. Some surviving B-25s are displayed in full strafer configuration with forward-firing guns restored. When these guns are fired during demonstrations with blanks, the sound shakes the ground. The muzzle flashlights the air, and the aircraft shudders with recoil. For a brief moment, modern audiences glimpse what it was like to face a weapon system born of desperation, innovation, and fury. Museums worldwide preserve this legacy. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where Gunn once instructed, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. Each aircraft tells a story of ingenuity under fire and of one man's refusal to accept defeat. In 1959, General George C. Kenney, by then retired, ensured the story would not be forgotten. He published the saga of Pappy Gunn, calling him one of the most important figures in the Pacific War, a man whose unauthorized innovations saved thousands of lives and shortened the conflict. Later, Nathaniel Gunn, Pappy's youngest son, wrote from the family's perspective, describing the years of imprisonment in Santo Tomas and the long-awaited liberation. Together, their words preserved not just the history of weapons and tactics, but the human story of endurance and sacrifice. Recognition eventually followed. In 1975, the United States Air Force named a training facility in Gunn's honor. It was long overdue. He had never sought fame, nor medals, nor headlines. What he sought was effectiveness and freedom for his family. The lesson of Pappy Gunn remains as relevant now as it was then. Innovation can come from anywhere. Bureaucracy said no. Regulations said impossible. Yet necessity, combined with one man's determination, said otherwise. From a maintenance hangar in New Guinea, a grieving father transformed an ordinary bomber into a devastating weapon system. The B-25 strafer sank ships, shattered convoys, and starved Japanese armies into collapse. It did not win the war alone. No single weapon did. Victory required millions of people, thousands of machines, and years of sacrifice. But the modified B-25 achieved results wildly disproportionate to its numbers. It showed what was possible when personal motivation aligned with military necessity. When failure was not an option, the story ends where it began, in the roar of engines, in the flash of tracers, in the thunder of bombs skipping across water to smash into steel hulls. The modified B-25 destroyed Japanese hopes of reinforcing their armies. It shortened the war. It saved Allied lives. And for Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn, it achieved the one goal that mattered most. It brought his family home.